Next up, we have a presentation from Richard Gerber, who is the best-selling author of 4 education books and a former UK headmaster, awarded by both UNESCO and the UK government for outstanding achievement. He'll be discussing accelerating lower-tech solutions that are more accessible. We're looking forward to your presentation, Richard, and over to you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. It's an absolute honor and a privilege to be with you, and just an extraordinary testament of the power of technology that even in such uncertain and extraordinary times, we can all be together in the way we are meeting here today. So look, I'm really not a technologist, and so I wanted to come at this presentation from a very human perspective. And in order to do that, I want to start here. I want to start by talking about the shared experience we've all had, wherever we are in the world, with the recent events of the last few months and our reactions to it, and what I think that means for us moving forward, thinking about education, and how technology can support and catalyze those transformations that we need to see in the future of education. So let me start on a very personal note. Let me start by talking about my personal journey through, if you like, the phases of the last few months. My last live event, my last day of travel, was coming back from Australia at the end of February. And when I returned to the UK, which is where I'm based, things started to crack off, and they started to crack off pretty quickly. But I remember that minute that I realized COVID was really going to hit us as a society and community. I went into a kind of paralysis, a state where no matter what people were saying, no matter what I was hearing, I just couldn't take it in. I couldn't absorb the information. But I moved quickly from that into a strange period, I think, of denial. I moved into a place where I started to think to myself, well, this isn't really going to be here for very long. This isn't really going to have a major impact on us or our society or our professional lives. This will be over by Easter time. This will be over by our summer. And of course, when we realized we were in this for the long haul, I think my next emotional response was one of anger. I wanted to blame everybody and anybody I could for the situation we were in. And I think that's because what was beginning to happen was a growing realization that I had no control. I couldn't pull any levers in any direction that could seemingly give me back control of the situation we were sliding into. And when anger didn't work, I think, like many people, I spent a period of time feeling listless, stressed, I suppose mildly depressed. There was an absence of hope. I'd almost given up. I just felt like, well, I'm a victim of this. And I think what's interesting when we reflect on those 4 phases of development through the human response to unplanned change, and particularly something as seismic as COVID, we're actually describing not just the human experience through this dreadful pandemic, but actually for most people, their reflex and response to change when they feel it's being done to them. And I think to an extent, this is a very lived experience for educators all over the world for a very long time, and particularly when we talk about and reference technology. Many educators feel threatened, powerlessness. They feel that somehow their role will be dehumanized and threatened. They feel threatened because they don't understand it and don't feel they can control it. And like all things with change, the way we step out of that endpoint of a kind of mild depression caused by powerlessness is to somehow go from feeling reactive to feeling proactive. And the answer to that really lies in the next 2 phases of change process. And the first and most crucial one is to encourage people to be curious, to fire their curiosity, to fire their questions, not to be judgmental. And by asking questions, by being curious about the events you're in, a weird thing starts to happen psychologically. You start to feel you have a little bit more control and a little bit more purpose. And that allows you to grow. It certainly did for me through COVID. You know, as a spending most of my life traveling the world as a professional speaker, that part of my life had ended, at least I hope temporarily. But then it was a question of, okay, how can I use technology to support my offer? How can I use technology to give me a feeling of control and power back? And that's how I pulled myself out of the last few months and started to feel that I was in a position of being able to be active again. Now, I think we're at a very seismic and interesting period in human history, and particularly when it comes to education. And the danger, I think, that I've seen over a vast number of years, over 2 decades, nearly 3 decades now in education, is that every time something new comes along or there's a new opportunity, we tend to make the mistake of thinking, how can we make this new idea, this new technology, do what we've always done, but more efficiently? You know, we see it so often as a challenge within education that we always come back to thinking about, okay, so how can I use that to do what I've always done? How can I use it to ensure I do what I've always done, but more efficiently? And it's one of the great sadnesses for me about the way we've seen technology implemented in so many places around the world in education. And maybe this COVID experience has given us a chance to step back and truly reflect and to recalibrate a vision for the future. A couple of years ago, I had the extraordinary honor and opportunity to meet Eric Schmidt, who was at the time the executive chairman of Google. And I actually managed, don't ask me how, I managed to get myself lunch with Eric. And when we sat down, there were 2 things that I really wanted to talk to him about. The first was this. I asked him almost the obvious question, from an educator like me to one of the gurus of technological evolution. I said, do you ever see a time where technology will replace the teacher? And he thought about it for less than a second. His answer was immediate and unequivocal. He said, no, never. And I was a bit taken aback because of who Eric was. I said, oh, talk me through that. He said, well, really, Richard, it's very simple. Technology is an extraordinary tool. It is an unbelievable catalyst. It has the power to democratize information. It is extraordinary in every sense. But, he said, education primarily and at its core has always been and always will be about the development of human beings. And in order to develop human beings, you will always need high levels of human interaction. That's really struck with me ever since, and I'll come back to it in a minute as I move through the few thoughts I have for you this afternoon. But the second thing I asked him was this. I said, what do you think have been your greatest challenges during your time at Google? You see, he joined Google from being the CEO of Hewlett-Packard and was brought in by the 2 brilliant creators of the Google concept, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, to help turn the Google concept into a business. He said, and when I arrived at Google, it was the most exciting place I had ever worked in my entire life. It was an ideas factory built around the foundational vision of Google, which was, in its infancy, to organize the world's information, to make it accessible for everybody, and by so doing, diminish evil. He said, and the ideas flowed. He said, one day I remember walking past a creative director who'd gathered around her a team of people, and she was sharing an idea. How could we map the world in images so that people could visit anywhere virtually from the comfort of their laptop or desktop computers? And of course, that became Google Earth. He said it was a remarkable time. He said, weirdly, the great challenge for us has come as we've become more successful. He said, the more successful we've become, the more we moved from being a proactive organization into a reactive organization. He said, the nature of our meetings changed. People weren't talking about the ideas and the things we could do to meet our foundational vision anymore. They were talking about, have you seen what other tech organizations are doing? Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, whoever it might be, Apple. He said, when I track the greatest disasters in our history, they have always come when we've tried to react to what other people are doing. And I think this is extremely true for us to reflect on as educators. Because in many ways, what we need to do now is take stock and take a breath and take control and ownership of our schools, in our communities, wherever we are in the world, and build out from a new vision, rather than believing that the silver bullets and the quick and easy ideas come in structural form and can simply be implemented. You know, it's one of the great arguments EdTech experts, far greater than me, have made for many years. Technology is not simply a substitute for what we always do. It has to enhance our vision and values. And so with that in mind, I want to explore a little bit about what those vision and values need to be moving forwards. And I want to start here with the OECD, who are an organization that have very mixed emotions for many educators because of the way that the PISA international league tables are often reported and acted upon by media and policymakers. But actually, the power of the OECD's research in education is actually in the detail. And in 2013, they published an extraordinary, globally reaching piece of research called the Skills Outlook. They've published more since, but the first one was the Skills Outlook 2013. And in that report, they did something for the first time on a global level where they really explored through research the links between education, employability, and skills. And I want to share with you now 4 of the key headlines from the executive summary of that report. And I want us all to consider as educators, not only how we can use this research moving forward as part of our foundational vision, but maybe more crucially, how technology can support the evolution of these 4 key principles. So here were the 4 findings. The first finding basically talks about the fact that the countries who are focused almost in their entirety on the acquisition of qualifications rather than the development of knowledge and skills are the countries where young people are going to find it increasingly difficult to find employment. Now, I think that's an incredible challenge for all of us, because so much of our education around the world is focused on outcomes based on tests and assessment, exams and qualifications. And of course, what the research pointed out was that in those countries where that was the ultimate focus, teachers and schools were forced into focusing on preparing children to take those tests and exams, often at the expense of the breadth of the learning, both skills and knowledge that those young people would really need in order not just to survive, but thrive in that outside world. The second key finding was based on the research from the requirements of some of the world's biggest employers, most influential organizations outside of education. And what that research showed was really interesting. It showed whereas 50, 60, 70 years ago, organizations, when they were looking for the skill set they wanted for in future employees, were about routine cognition, about the ability to take in information, often technical, to remember it, to process it, and to be able to repeat it with a maximum level of efficiency. What those organizations were looking for now was something completely different. The most important quality, by far, were interpersonal skills, human relationship stuff, the ability to collaborate, to be curious, to work in teams, to be flexible. And that leads to the third finding, which said that actually the future workforce needs to be able to learn continuously throughout their life. They need to be able to adapt, and they need to be able to change. And has that not been brought into sharper focus than ever before in the last few months? And certainly moving forward out of COVID, as the global economy and the shockwave around it will reverberate for many, many generations and has already transformed global working opportunities. How do we use education? How do we use technology to ensure that everybody has access to the ability to learn, adapt, and change right the way through their lives? And then the fourth finding I find really fascinating, because the fourth finding is one that speaks about creating much stronger links between the worlds of work and education if we're to create one bridged narrative, rather than seeing education and the future workplace as separate silos. These, I think, are challenges that technology can help us find an answer to. Now I want to introduce you to another remarkable man. This is Barish. Barish was the 2017 Nobel Prize winner for physics, for his work into his research into gravitational waves. Many experts consider him to be one of the greatest minds of the late 20th and 21st century. And I had the great privilege of talking to him not that long ago. And I had the chance to, again, ask him in similar ways that I did Eric about the background to his success. And I started by asking about his recruitment process. I said, you know, when you started to recruit for the research team that went on to win this Nobel Prize, how many serious applications did you have? He said, well, like serious applications, there were over 3,500. And by serious, what he meant was scientists with world-renowned reputations, often with at least 2 doctorates to their name, research papers published all over the world in the most renowned spaces and places. I said, so how many places did you have funding for? He said, actually, it was a really large research team, but I had enough funding for 138 places. So I said, how did you get 3,500 down to 138? He said, well, there were 2 key principles for me. And again, I think they resonate in our space and time now. He said the first was this: they had to be 3-dimensional, rounded people. People who had one-track experiences, who were just pure scientists, were of no use to me. Because if you're going to innovate, if you're going to create, you have to have people with rounded experiences. So he said, I wanted people on my team who were not only experts in fields of science, but had the arts and humanities in their background too. That's an interesting challenge for us as we think about a broadened offer for education, don't you think? And the second thing he said is one of the most brilliant things I've ever heard anybody say, because of its simplicity and complexity at the same time. He said the second criteria we were looking for was to ensure that we had people that had the ability to ask stupid questions. Just think about that for a moment. What actually does it take to have the ability to ask a stupid question? Is there such a thing? And how do we ensure that we create an education system which is predicated on that, and not necessarily the celebration of getting everything right? You know, I don't know about you, but one of the most important things I think I've learned in my time as an educator is this: you learn nothing new by getting something right. You only ever learn something new from the point of a mistake, or the realization that you don't know something, or you can't do something. And so how do we create an education system which celebrates that? The ability to have the confidence to ask a stupid question, to make mistakes, to fail, to bounce back and come again. And we know that that's a human condition, but that technology can support that in so many ways. I'm just going to skip on and finish with 2 last thoughts for you about 2 more incredible people I've had the privilege to meet in the last few years. This first one is a man called Sebastian Fuca. Sebastian is French, and he is most renowned because he is the creator or the co-creator of parkour, or free running. For any of you that have ever watched a James Bond film, and particularly the first of Daniel Craig's James Bond films, Casino Royale, you may remember Sebastian because he was the bad guy being chased over buildings and cranes in the incredible opening sequence. He's a remarkable human being. And I first met him actually on a trip to Yekaterinburg in Russia. And we went for a walk on our day off through the city, a beautiful historic place, actually the place where the Tsar and Tsarina and their children were slaughtered at the end of the Russian Revolution. and a beautiful architectural place. Anyway, we walked through together for a couple of hours and went back to our hotel, and we were talking. And I said, isn't this a remarkable city? He said, Richard, really? I don't know. What do you mean? I said, the buildings. He said, I don't look at buildings. He said, really, it's where parkour, free running, comes from. He said, when I was a child, I grew up in a really tough community north of Paris, and all I saw around me was concrete. It felt like a prison. He said, one day in my childish imagination, I remember seeing a shaft of light appear between the small gap in two of the buildings. And I spent the afternoon imagining where that shaft of light and that gap could take me. He said, have you ever walked through an urban landscape and rather than looked at the building, looked at the spaces between them? And I thought and realized I hadn't. And he said, because that's the problem with so much of the way we're trained and educated to think. We spend so much of our lives looking at the obstacles, the buildings, the things in the way, the buts. He said that actually we obsess with them and we forget that the real magic occurs in the spaces between them, because the spaces are smaller, but they're there. And actually, if you can find the courage and way to explore the spaces, that's how you can maximize your journey. And again, as I come towards a close, I think to myself, you know, that's something we need to think about now more than ever, and certainly in education. There will always be obstacles. There will always be reasons why we can't do things. But actually, the great skill is to think like a free runner and look for the spaces because they're there, and then to have the courage to step through them. And that leads me to my final meeting and my final thought for you this afternoon. And thank you so much for your time and attention. And I'm going to end with the proudest moment of my professional life, the most substantive meeting I've ever had. And if I can show you this photograph, you'll understand why. Because my final meeting was a couple of years ago when I got to spend time with the former President of the United States, Barack Obama. And like the other important and impressive people I've shared with you today, I want to close with this thought. I asked him about what he'd learned most from his time in the White House. And he said this. He said, Richard, when I first started in the White House, I surrounded myself with the world's greatest technical experts, scientists, economists, policymakers, everyone from every field. He said, but when I think back on my 8 years of the White House and I reflect, I realize this. Most of the challenges of problems that crossed my desk were never technical by nature. When you strip back the issues, nearly all of them were human. They were about love, anger, hatred, jealousy, greed, tribalism. He said, and my final reflection is this. Please don't reflexively think the answer to every problem lies in the technical first. You have to understand the human challenge if you're going to really succeed. And that's really where I want to finish with you today. Thank you so much for taking part. Thanks for listening. Thank you for being part of what is an extraordinary event over these 2 incredible days. But please go away and think this. If we're going to begin this journey again, we need to start with the human challenge and the human condition. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. An amazing presentation and some really great insights for everyone all around the world to take away with them. So thank you for that.
Rebecca, it's my pleasure. I hope it's what you guys wanted.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll be moving on to our next panel of the day, which will be about highly personalizing the learning experience. So please make your way into the next panel session, and thank you once again to Richard.